verbal aspect. What is it? Is it important? In this video, we're going to take a look at this book. Hi, I'm Darryl Burling from Master New Testament Greek, here to help you with the tools, habits, and system to master the Greek of the New Testament. If you're interested in biblical Greek, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and then hit the notify bell to be notified when new videos are released. If you've been trained in biblical Greek any time over the last 30 years, you would have heard about verbal aspect. But you may have been told by your professor or your teacher that you don't have to worry about that at this stage, or that it's not even relevant, or that it's not something that is valid for what you're trying to do. Is it important? Should you care? Does it matter to exegesis? Those are the key questions you really need to ask yourself and answer. And so with that in mind, we're going to be looking at Constantine Campbell's Basics of Verbal Greek, this book, to understand how it lays out the argument, the discussion about this question, the conclusions it comes to, and also whether you should consider purchasing and reading this book. Let's start by talking about what the book is like. How does he break it up? How does he answer the question of what is verbal aspect and why is it important? He breaks it into two parts. The first part, he's really talking about the theory behind verbal aspect. And he does this in over a period of about 3 or 4 chapters where he's breaking down an explanation of what verbal aspect is. And here he makes some really helpful distinctions between things like aspect and actionsart. And then he talks about differences like semantics and pragmatics. And these are really helpful categories that not only does he use to explain what verbal aspect is, but also to explain, even as you go through the book, how it works and functions. And so this is a really foundational chapter, and it really is a good overview of what verbal aspect is, and it does give you a good lead-in to how you can actually start to apply it in your own study of the Greek New Testament. He then moves on in chapter 2 to talk about the history of the argument or the discussion around verbal aspect, starting from the late 1800s all the way through today, breaking it really into 2 segments, the early period and then the late period. And the late period starts really in about the 1980s. He does this by looking at the 3 different types of scholars who have been considering verbal aspect. Those are the general linguists, the Greek philologists, those people who are specialists in Greek language, and then New Testament research people. And so he looks at the research from these 3 groups, and he goes through different contributors in this chapter to the argument, which one of these 3 disciplines they come from, and some of the ways they've contributed to this discussion. He also has a section at the end of this chapter that talks about things that still need to be agreed on amongst scholars, as well as things that have already been agreed on, that everybody's kind of already settled on. In terms of the things that still need to be agreed on, there are really 2 things. One of those is whether there is a third aspect or not. In fact, let me put it this way, it's whether state is an aspect or an actionsart. And Campbell's argument throughout the entire book is that state is actually an actionsart, not an aspect. And so he takes a slightly different view on the perfect. We'll talk about that in just a moment. The other thing that is still to be finalized is really whether Greek tenses and Greek verbs really are tenses. That is to say, whether there really is time in them. And there are 2 camps on this. One where there is no time in the verbs, and one where there is time in the verbs. And again, Campbell comes on the side where there is no time in the verbs, which is where people like Stanley Porter have also arrived. From there, he talks a little bit about the different tense forms. The semantics of the tense forms themselves encode both the imperfective or the perfective aspect, okay, so whether an event is seen as a whole or whether it's seen as an event in progress. And then secondly, whether the event is seen from a proximity perspective, as in like a nearness kind of idea, or whether it's seen from the point of view of remoteness, okay? And so he looks at all the different tense forms and just sort of gives an overview of how this breaks down. Having dealt with the theory behind the tense forms, then he goes on to talk about the implementation of verbal aspect. So here he takes the discussion of semantics and pragmatics and adds to that a good discussion around how the meaning of the word itself contributes to the actionsart of a verb. Okay, and the actionsart, of course, if you don't already know what that means, that's just really the way the verb is being used in the context. This is your nomic perfect or nomic aorist or durative present or whatever it is. Okay, these are those different categories. And so he's arguing that the lexeme itself has a role to play in working out the actionsart of the verb. So in other words, if something is a perfect, and it's stative, then it's not stative because it's in the perfect, it's stative because the lexeme, the context, that is the pragmatics, and the semantics of the verb all lend themselves to that. He also talks about different forms of the tenses. For each different form of the verb, he talks about the semantics, that is what the tense form encodes, plus the lexeme and the context, and then by putting these things together, he shows how these three things together give you the actionsart of a word, how the word is being used in that given context. And this is really one of the big strengths of not only the book, but also of Campbell's approach, is that it becomes so easy to understand and identify a verbal form by using these three things: the semantics, like encoding what the actual tense form gives you, the lexeme, the meaning of the verb, and then the context, specifically how things like genre and even the sentence structure contribute to the meaning of the verb and how the verb is being used in that context. And so he goes through then all the different actionsarts. So if you're used to seeing an actionsart in, say, Wallace's Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics, and you want to see how Campbell looks at that, well, you often can map what one of Wallace's or any of the other major grammars, you can map their actionsarts, their categories, if you want to put it that way, to what Campbell's saying, and you can see how those same categories form in the verbal aspect system. And so that makes it very easy to understand not only the significance of verbal aspect and what it contributes to your exegesis, but also how it relates even to older grammars, and so how it would replace some of the understanding that the older grammars may have. In fact, that leads to an issue really, in that one of the issues with some of these older grammars is they tell you the actionsart of a word, but they don't tell you how they come to their conclusion. And this is, like I mentioned before, this is where Campbell's work really is powerful, is that it gives you a process and a system to be able to understand how a verb is working in context and can assign your own category to it using a pretty reliable approach. Now, throughout this section where he goes through the presents and the imperfects and the aorists and the perfects and so on, he's going to give you exercises as well, so you can actually work through and test yourself, and there's answers in the back of the book as well, so you can really master the system quite easily. He also provides at the end a chapter dedicated to participles, so you can work out how verbal aspect works with participles, and then a final chapter on space and time, which is a fascinating chapter in that it works through different languages and how languages work with regards to just simple temporal versus spatial concepts. And what he argues here really is that Greek is moving from a spatial language to a temporal language, and modern Greek is much more of a temporal language than what Koine Greek was, and in fact classical Greek was much more of a spatial language than what Koine Greek was as well. That's really an overview of how the book is structured. So how do you evaluate a book on verbal aspect? Especially a book where it's breaking away from some of the existing grammars that are on the market and trying to understand how valid is this. And I think one of the tests that we can apply to the verbal aspect discussion generally is how well does a particular theory fit with not only the main facts of how we've been taught the language, but the exceptions. Because with the traditional approach to verbs, there are things like an aorist, which is generally regarding things that have taken place in the past. The problem with that is that you sometimes get things like a future aorist. And how do you explain a future aorist if the aorist is supposed to regard something that's taken place in the past? So the question of things like verbal aspect is, how does it account for those sorts of exceptions? This is where Campbell's work is particularly helpful. He has an approach which is slightly different to a lot of the other approaches out there, but yet that has, I think, very good explanatory power. So he can explain how an aorist can actually work in the future and not be contrary to the purpose or the role of the aorist in the language. Finally, he talks about the perfect tense, and when he talks about the perfect tense, he has an explanation for how the perfect tense is working that does give us a really helpful understanding of things like the intensive perfect, and how the intensive perfect is not stative but is actually providing another layer of information that is helpful when it comes to exegesis. Another one of the real strengths of Campbell's books is that it makes the whole approach to verbs very simple, very understandable, and by simply knowing how the semantics, the lexeme, and the context are working in any given example, you can actually work out for yourself the actionsart with Campbell's system. That you don't have to depend on the grammarians to work out how a verb may be working in a context. You can see it for yourself. And to help you with that, I created a verbal cheat sheet based on Campbell's basics of verbal aspect, and you can download that for free from mntg.me/verbsheet, and I'll leave a link to that in the description below. So one of the last things I just mentioned about this book is, even though verbal aspect feels like it's a big subject, this book is very short. It's less than 200 pages and it's very readable. It's written for an average Greek student. You don't have to be a scholar to be able to read this. If you've got a little bit of Greek behind you, this book is well worth the couple of hours it's probably going to take you to read through it. There is just one thing that I would change, and that is that last chapter on time and space. Personally, I think that actually contributes to the theory of verbal aspect, and therefore I think that should be earlier in the book. But this is a very minor comment. I think that, having it at the end, it felt like you were just going back to the beginning of the book again, and it would have been better just to have that as part of the beginning piece, the section on theory, rather than putting it after the implementation section of the book. Who is this book right for? Well, this book is ideal if you've finished beginning Greek and you're ready to sort of roll up your sleeves and get into a bit more Greek and want to refresh yourself on verbs perhaps. This book is ideal. You don't necessarily have to have finished intermediate Greek. That may be helpful, but if you've finished beginning Greek, this will get you back into Greek verbs and will help you and challenge you to think through them in a new way. And that's going to be really helpful, even if you don't agree with the verbal aspect approach that Campbell puts forward. This is also a great book just to have on your shelf as a reference. Like I said, the very simple semantics, lexeme, and context approach that he provides for Actionsart based on the verbal aspect system is something you're going to want to look up time and time again as you're doing exegesis. And so I think this is a great book to have on your shelf just as a reference. Who's this book not right for? Well, I wouldn't give this to a beginning Greek student. If you're going through and you haven't hit verbs yet and you haven't got your head around how Greek verbs work, just wait to get this book, get it later on when you've done the verbs, and then you can have a look through it. But just whatever your teacher's going through right now, just focus on getting that down, and then once you've got a bit of headspace, then go back and spend a bit of time getting a book like this and understanding how verbs work from a different perspective. So I hope this has been helpful. Don't forget to go to mntg.me/verbsheet and get your free verbal cheat sheet that goes with basics of verbal aspect. And let me ask you this as we finish here. Have you read this book? What do you think of verbal aspect, and what do you think of Campbell's approach? Leave a comment in the comment section below, and I look forward to interacting with you there. If this has been helpful, go ahead and hit the subscribe button below and hit the notify bell so that you're notified when new videos come out. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Until then, keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery of Greek. See you later.